The ledger of the frontier wasn't just written in gold dust and blood. Sometimes it was tallied in human souls. In the brutal winter of '64, a desperate man traded his wife to a saloon syndicate to save his own neck. He didn't expect a savage mountain man to buy her back. Bannack, Montana Territory was a place where morality froze to death long before the December snows set in. The air inside the Bloody Horn Saloon was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale whiskey, and the metallic tang of desperation. At the center of this rot stood Titus Higgins. Titus was a man hollowed out by the gold rush. He hadn't struck a vein, but he had struck a fierce addiction to the faro tables. His hands trembled, not from the biting draft whistling through the saloon's floorboards, but from the terrifying reality of the ledger sitting on Elias Sterling's desk. Elias was a man who owned half the town and the souls of the other half. He didn't deal in extensions. He dealt in broken knees and shallow graves. $750, Titus, Elias purred, leaning back in his velvet-upholstered chair, the only clean piece of furniture in the establishment. By midnight, or my boys take you out to the hanging tree, and we see how much weight your neck can bear. Titus dropped to his knees, his eyes darting frantically. I ain't got it, Elias. You know I don't. The claim is dusted. But I have property. Valuable property. Elias raised an eyebrow, taking a slow drag from his cigar. You don't own a mule worth spitting on, Titus. I own Linda. The words hung in the smoky air, vile and heavy. Titus scrambled to his feet, a manic light in his eyes. She's young, 22. Good teeth, strong back, pretty enough when she ain't crying. You take her, Elias. Work her in the saloon. Sell her off. I don't care. Just wipe the slate. Elias chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. A wife sale? That's an old English custom, Titus. But this is the frontier. If you want to pay your debt with your bride, we do it at the bar. Highest bidder takes her. And if it crosses $750, you keep your life. Within the hour, Linda Higgins was dragged through the swinging doors. She was a woman who had left a respectable life in Ohio for the promise of the West, only to have the prairie strip her of her illusions and her husband strip her of her dignity. Her calico dress was frayed, her hands raw from lye soap, but beneath the grime and the terror, there was a quiet, enduring beauty. She didn't scream. The betrayal was too absolute for noise. She stood on the rough-hewn planks of a faro table, a rope loosely tied around her wrist like a halter, staring at the floor as the crowd of miners, drifters, and outlaws began to circle. 200, a voice barked. 300 for the little homemaker, another yelled, accompanied by drunken laughter. Titus stood by the bar, sweating, urging them on. She can cook, she can mend. 400, come on, boys. Linda squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear cutting a clean path down her soot-stained cheek. She prayed for the floor to open up and swallow her. She prayed for a stray bullet from a drunken brawl. Then, the swinging doors didn't just open. They were nearly ripped from their leather hinges. The saloon went deathly quiet. Stepping into the smoky haze was a man who looked like the mountains had spat him out. He stood over 6'3", wrapped in a heavy coat of gray wolf pelt. His beard was thick and dark, his eyes a piercing, glacial blue that seemed to drop the temperature of the room by another 10 degrees. A Henry repeating rifle rested easily in the crook of his arm, and a massive Bowie knife was strapped to his thigh. This was Jedediah Coulter. He was a trapper, a man who lived high up in the Bitterroots where even the most hardened outlaws refused to tread. He only came down twice a year for salt, coffee, and ammunition. Jedediah didn't look at the men. He looked at the woman standing on the table, the rope around her delicate wrist, and the sniveling coward of a husband playing auctioneer. 500, a filthy prospector hollered, breaking the silence. Jedediah walked slowly to the center of the room. The crowd parted instinctively, recognizing a predator in their midst. He stopped right in front of Elias Sterling, who was watching with a look of cautious amusement. What's the debt? Jedediah's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like boulders shifting deep underground. 750, Elias said. his smile fading slightly under the mountain man's intense stare. Jedediah reached into his heavy canvas duster and pulled out a swollen, blood-stained leather pouch. He slammed it onto the table with a thud that rattled the empty shot glasses. "There's an ounce over 1,000 in unminted gold in there," Jedediah said, his eyes never leaving Elias's. "The woman comes down from that table. Now." Titus let out a hysterical laugh of relief. "Sold! Sold to the mountain man. Bless you, stranger. You just saved my—" Jedediah turned. His massive, calloused hand shot out, grabbing Titus by the throat. He lifted the man until his boots dangled 2 inches off the sawdust-covered floor. "I didn't buy her to save you," Jedediah whispered, his voice vibrating with restrained violence. "I bought her because I don't abide a man treating his kin worse than a sled dog. If I ever see your face on this side of the Continental Divide again, I'll skin you and leave you for the crows. Understand?" Titus choked out a desperate, wheezing agreement. Jedediah dropped him like a sack of spoiled grain. He walked over to Linda, who was trembling violently. He drew his hunting knife. Linda flinched, bracing for the blade, but Jedediah only slid the razor-sharp edge under the rope around her wrist, severing it with a flick of his wrist. "Get your coat, ma'am," Jedediah said softly, the harshness completely vanishing from his tone. "We're losing the daylight." The ride into the Bitterroot Mountains was a grueling, silent affair. Linda sat atop a sturdy roan gelding, her thin wool coat doing little to fend off the biting November wind. Jedediah rode ahead on a massive black draft horse, carving a path through the rising snowdrifts. For 2 days, Linda lived in a state of suspended terror. She had been purchased like a sack of flour. She knew the stories of mountain men, that they were feral, half-crazed from isolation, and brutal to whatever fell into their clutches. Yet every time she shivered, Jedediah stopped, built a fire, and handed her a tin cup of hot chicory coffee. He never looked at her with the leering hunger she had seen in the eyes of the men in the Bloody Horn. He looked at her with a profound, almost sorrowful pity. On the evening of the 2nd day, they reached his cabin. It sat nestled in a grove of ancient ponderosa pines, sturdy and heavily insulated with mud and moss. Inside, it was Spartan, but immaculately clean. A wood stove radiated a deep, comforting heat. Furs were stacked neatly in the corners, and jars of preserved berries lined the shelves. Jedediah brought her small carpet bag inside and set it by the single, heavy timber bed. "You'll sleep there," he said, shaking the snow from his wolf pelt coat. Linda stood by the door, her arms wrapped around herself. And where will you sleep?" "By the stove. Same as always." He turned his back to her, stoking the fire. "I know what you're thinking, Mrs. Higgins. You're thinking you traded one hell for another. But you ain't a slave here, and you ain't my wife. You're a guest. Soon as the passes thaw in April, I'll take you down to Virginia City and put you on a stagecoach to wherever you want to go. Until then, we survive the winter." Linda collapsed onto the edge of the bed, the sheer exhaustion and relief breaking the dam of her emotions. She wept silently into her hands. Jedediah didn't try to comfort her. He understood that some tears just needed to fall. Over the next month, a tentative rhythm developed in the cabin. Linda, desperate to earn her keep and terrified of being a burden, took over the cooking and the mending. Jedediah hunted, chopped wood, and treated her with a gruff, distant respect. He never crossed the invisible line he had drawn between them. Slowly, Linda's terror began to thaw. She noticed the way his eyes softened when he fed the chickadees that landed on the porch, and the quiet intelligence in his voice when he told her about the changing seasons of the high country. For the first time in years, she felt safe. But the frontier rarely allows for a lasting peace. The twist of her fate unraveled on a Tuesday in late December. Jedediah was out checking his trap lines, leaving Linda alone. She decided to thoroughly clean out her carpet bag, looking for a scrap of fabric to patch one of Jedediah's shirts. As she emptied the bag, she noticed the lining at the bottom felt unusually stiff. Frowning, she tugged at a loose thread. The fabric gave way, revealing a false leather bottom. Linda's breath hitched. Tucked inside the hidden compartment were 3 thick stacks of bound, mint-condition banknotes. They were territorial bearer bonds. She pulled them out, her hands shaking. There had to be over $10,000 here. Wrapped around the money was a hastily scrawled note in Titus's handwriting. "Elias," it read, "if you're reading this, you found the girl. I told you she stole the bonds from your safe. Keep her. Kill her. I don't care. The debt is paid. Don't come looking for me." The blood drained from Linda's face. The room suddenly felt freezing, despite the roaring fire. Titus hadn't just sold her to pay a gambling debt. Titus had robbed Elias Sterling, the most dangerous man in the territory. He had hidden the stolen money in her bag, knowing she would be sold, knowing she would carry the evidence away. He had set her up as the thief, using her public humiliation at the auction as a distraction to make his own escape. She wasn't just a woman waiting out the winter. She was the prime target of a ruthless syndicate. Elias wouldn't have just accepted the money at the auction and let it go. He would have realized the bonds were missing from his safe shortly after. And when he remembered the carpetbag the mountain man had carried out of the saloon, a heavy thud on the porch snapped her out of her panic. She scrambled to shove the money back into the bag, her heart hammering against her ribs. The door swung open, bringing a flurry of snow and a grim-faced Jedediah. He wasn't carrying game. He was holding a dead, snow-crusted horse by its frozen reins. "Jedediah?" Linda whispered, stepping back. "Pack your things," he said, his voice hard, his eyes locking onto the carpetbag on the bed. "I found a rider a mile down the ridge, dead from the cold. But his horse made it this far." He had a bounty poster in his pocket. Jedediah pulled a crumpled, wet piece of paper from his coat and tossed it onto the table. Linda didn't need to read the fine print to recognize the sketched face on the paper. It was her. And the bounty at the bottom read, "Wanted alive, $2,000 reward. By order of Elias Sterling." "They're coming, Linda," Jedediah said, pulling his rifle from his shoulder and checking the chamber. "And they're not waiting for the spring thaw." The silence in the cabin was heavier than the snow accumulating on the slate roof. Linda stared at the wanted poster, the crude sketch of her face mocking her from the rough-hewn table. She looked up at Jedediah, whose expression was as unreadable as a granite cliff. She lunged for the carpetbag, upending it onto the bed. The stacks of territorial bearer bonds tumbled out, stark and undeniable against the gray wool blanket. Titus put them there. Linda choked out, the words tumbling over each other in her panic. "He robbed Elias Sterling. He framed me. Jedediah, I swear on my life, I didn't know. He sold me to buy time, and he used me as a pack mule to smuggle the money out of Bannock." Jedediah walked over, picking up a stack of the bonds with a thick, calloused finger. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse her. He just let out a long, slow breath that plumed in the cold air rushing through the open door. "Sterling's men don't care about the truth, Linda. They care about the ledger," Jedediah said, turning away to pull a heavy canvas pack from the wall. "And right now, you're the missing ink. Put your warmest clothes on. Layer everything. We can't stay here." "But where will we go?" she asked, her hands shaking as she pulled a heavy wool sweater over her head. "There's a blizzard coming." "Up," Jedediah replied simply, tossing her a pair of snowshoes. "Sterling's gun thugs are flatlanders. They ride horses and rely on numbers. In the high timber, horses break their legs, and numbers just mean more targets. We head for the Widow's Maw. It's an old silver shaft near the timberline. Defensible. Only one way in." Within 20 minutes, the cabin was stripped of essentials. Ammunition, dried venison, medical supplies, and the carpetbag of bonds were packed. Before they stepped off the porch, Jedediah took a small keg of black powder from the cellar, placed it inside the wood stove, and banked the coals just enough so it would catch when the stove was inevitably stoked by freezing intruders. The trek was a brutal, agonizing ascent. The wind howled through the ponderosa pines like a chorus of dying animals, whipping ice crystals into their faces. Linda's lungs burned, and her legs felt like lead weights, but the sheer terror of what lay behind them kept her moving. Jedediah broke the trail, his massive frame shielding her from the worst of the gale. Every hour, he would pause, check her face for frostbite, offer a sip from his canteen, and press on. They reached the widow's maw just as the last light bled from the sky. It was a jagged tear in the side of the mountain, hidden behind a curtain of frozen waterfall. Once inside, the roar of the wind vanished, replaced by the hollow, dripping silence of the cave. Jedediah built a small, smokeless fire, using dry moss and twigs he had carried in his pack. "Get close to the heat," he ordered, unrolling a heavy buffalo hide. Linda collapsed onto the fur, her teeth chattering violently. "Will they follow us in this?" "Sterling pays $100 a day to his best trackers," Jedediah said, sitting cross-legged near the entrance, his Henry rifle resting across his knees, and he sent Cole. "I recognized the dead man's horse down the ridge. It had Cole's brand. Cole's a man who'd track a ghost through hell for a silver dollar. They'll find the cabin tonight. Tomorrow, they'll find us." His prediction was off, by exactly 12 hours. Shortly after dawn, a muffled thump echoed up the valley, followed by a faint rumble that shook the dust from the cave ceiling. Jedediah's black powder trap had worked. "That's one way to thin the herd," Jedediah muttered, peering through a crack in the rock face. He pulled a spyglass from his coat, but it didn't get Cole. And, well, I'll be damned. "What is it?" Linda asked, creeping up beside him. Jedediah handed her the glass. "Look at the man they have tied to the lead mule." Linda squinted through the brass tube. Down in the valley, a mile away and moving slowly up the treacherous switchbacks, was a line of 6 men. 5 were heavily armed, wearing thick dusters. The 6th man, stumbling through the deep snow with his hands bound behind his back, was Titus. A cold fury replaced the fear in Linda's chest. Titus hadn't escaped. Sterling had caught him, realized the money was gone, and broke him until he confessed exactly where he had hidden it. Now, Titus was leading the wolves right to her door to save his own miserable hide. He told them about the false bottom in the bag, Linda whispered, handing the glass back. "It changes nothing," Jedediah said, jacking a shell into the chamber of his rifle. "They want the money, and they want the bounty. But they have to come up the Narrows to get here. You stay behind the ore cart, Linda. Do not look out. Do not make a sound." By noon, the storm broke, leaving the mountain bathed in a blinding, brilliant sunlight that reflected off the snow like shattered glass. The Narrows, a 50-yard stretch of exposed rocky ledge leading to the cave, was a death trap. Cole knew it, and Jedediah knew it. "Coulter!" a voice boomed from the tree line below the ledge. It was Cole, his voice rough as sandpaper. "We don't want the mountain man. We just want the girl and the bag. Send her out, and we ride away." Jedediah didn't answer. He aimed his rifle and fired. The bullet shattered the bark of the pine tree inches from Cole's head. The message was clear. A furious exchange of gunfire erupted. Lead chewed against the granite walls of the cave, sending razor-sharp rock splinters flying. Linda huddled behind a rusted iron ore cart, covering her ears as the deafening cracks echoed in the confined space. Jedediah moved with terrifying precision. He didn't waste a single bullet. Every time his Henry rifle barked, a scream echoed from the tree line. He dropped 2 men in the first 5 minutes. Realizing they couldn't win a shootout against a seasoned mountain man holding the high ground, Cole changed tactics. "Titus," he roared, "you want to live? Go get your wife." "No, Cole, please, he'll kill me." Titus's pathetic whine drifted up the mountain. "Walk, or I put a bullet in your spine right now." Linda peeked around the cart. Titus was forced out onto the narrow ledge, stumbling in the deep snow. He was a human shield. Cole and the remaining 2 men moved closely behind him, using Titus's body to block Jedediah's line of sight. "Linda!" Titus screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "Linda, please! Give them the bag! It's me, Titus!" Jedediah lowered his rifle slightly, his jaw tight. He wouldn't shoot through an unarmed man, even one as vile as Titus, to hit the outlaws behind him. The attackers were inching closer. 40 yards. 30 yards. Linda looked at the carpetbag. She looked at Jedediah, who was pinned down, unable to take a clear shot. She realized that as long as she was the victim, she would always be hunted. Titus had sold her, framed her, and now he was going to get the only man who had ever truly protected her killed. She opened the bag, pulled out one of the thick stacks of bonds, and stood up. "Linda, get down!" Jedediah shouted. She ignored him, stepping out into the light of the cave entrance. The wind whipped her hair across her face. "You want the money, Titus?" Linda yelled, her voice ringing clear and steady across the frozen expanse. "You want to pay your debt?" Titus stopped, his eyes widening at the sight of the cash in her hand. "Linda, yes, toss it down. They'll let us go." Cole laughed darkly from behind him. "Throw the bag, little lady." Linda struck a match against the rock wall. The flame flared, bright and steady in the crisp air. She held it an inch from the bundle of bonds. "I throw it into the fire," Linda said, her voice dripping with ice. "I burn it all, right here, right now, unless Cole and his men drop their rifles." A stunned silence fell over the ledge. Titus panicked. "No, Linda, don't! Sterling will kill me!" In his desperation, Titus did the one thing Cole hadn't anticipated. He turned around and lunged at Cole, trying to grab the outlaw's revolver to take control of the situation. It was a foolish, cowardly move, born of sheer panic. Cole cursed and shoved Titus backward. The ledge was narrow, coated in a fresh layer of slick ice. Titus lost his footing. His arms wheeled wildly in the air, a scream tearing from his throat as he slipped off the edge, plummeting out of sight into the rocky gorge hundreds of feet below. The human shield was gone. Jedediah didn't hesitate. Before Cole could raise his weapon back toward the cave, the Henry rifle cracked twice. Cole dropped dead in the snow. The remaining two outlaws, seeing their leader dead and the money about to be burned, broke rank. They turned and fled back down the mountain, scrambling over the snowdrifts in a desperate retreat. The silence returned to the mountain, absolute and profound. Linda blew out the match. Her knees finally gave out, and she sank to the cave floor, dropping the money beside her. She buried her face in her hands, shaking uncontrollably as the adrenaline left her system. Jedediah walked over, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and knelt beside her. He didn't offer platitudes. He reached out and placed a heavy, warm hand on her trembling shoulder, an anchor in the storm. 6 months later, the bitter chill of the Montana winter was nothing but a memory. The Bitterroot Valley was ablaze with purple lupine and golden arrowleaf balsam root. Linda stood on the porch of the rebuilt cabin, watching a hawk circle lazily in the cloudless blue sky. She wore a simple, clean denim dress, her face tanned and healthy. The carpetbag of money had been sent via an anonymous courier to a federal marshal in Virginia City, along with a detailed letter exposing Elias Sterling's gambling syndicates and his theft of territorial funds. Sterling had been arrested by federal troops before the spring thaw was even complete. Jedediah rode into the clearing on his black draft horse, leading a string of pack mules loaded with supplies for the summer. He dismounted, tied the reins, and walked up the porch steps, pulling off his worn leather gloves. He stopped in front of her, his glacial blue eyes softer than they had been when he first kicked through the doors of the Bloody Horn Saloon. "Got the mail in town," Jedediah said, handing her a newspaper. "Sterling's going to hang in August. The federal men cleared the bounty. You're a free woman, Linda. Stagecoach leaves for San Francisco on Tuesday. I bought you a ticket." Linda looked at the ticket in his hand. Then she looked up at the towering, quiet man who had pulled her from the depths of hell and taught her how to stand on her own 2 feet. "I don't recall asking for a ticket, Mr. Coulter," Linda said, her chin lifting defiantly. Jedediah shifted his weight, looking out toward the timberline. "It's a hard life up here, Linda. It ain't meant for a woman who deserves a proper home." "A proper home is where you aren't treated like property," she replied softly, stepping closer to him. "You bought my freedom, Jedediah, but you never tried to own me. You gave me back to myself." She reached out and took the ticket from his hand, tearing it slowly in half, and letting the pieces drift off the porch into the mountain breeze. "I'm not leaving." Jedediah looked down at her, a rare, genuine smile pulling at the corners of his bearded mouth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple braided band of silver he had fashioned from a raw nugget over the winter fires. "Then I suppose," Jedediah rumbled, his voice thick with emotion, "I should offer you my name. Not as a debt, Linda. But as a partner, Linda placed her hand in his, feeling the rough calluses that had shielded her from the world. She nodded, tears of true joy spilling over her lashes for the first time in her life. The frontier is an unforgiving ledger, balancing every sin with blood and every sorrow with an eventual spring. Linda didn't just survive the bitter winter. She forged a new spirit in its fires. When Jedediah offered his name, it wasn't a transaction of debt, but a promise of absolute freedom. Together, they rode out of the treacherous mountains, leaving the ghosts of their past buried deep beneath the melting snow.